Hey, good morning, guys. Most of today's lesson is going to be centered around a reading from an excerpt from the book. I just want to talk real quick about PTO shafts and their purpose. Um, PTO shafts are a piece of metal that unites the power takeoff stub shaft on the tractor to the actual gearbox or drive line on an implement. These shafts are telescoping, meaning that they are made to move inward and outward to compensate for movement between the tractor and the implement. So if that you had a trailed bush hog and you go over a hillside and the tractor starts to bridge the peak of that hillside before the mower, as that machinery pivots on the drawbar, that power takeoff shaft can compensate by sliding outward a little bit. On the same side, if that you were to come into the bottom of a hill, a valley, holler, and you were to roll into it and then pull up, that mower is then going to pivot downward from the tractor drawbar, and that's going to allow for that telescoping action to occur there. Power takeoff shafts, they have a steel rod that telescopes inside another steel rod, or a piece of tubing rather, if we wanted to be correct with our nomenclature. Welded to those pieces of tubing are going to be these things called yokes, and yokes are just these U-shaped pieces of metal that accept a universal joint. A universal joint is made up of a cross pattern, and then on top of those cross patterns there is a round bearing system called a needle bearing, and they typically clip into place either on the inside or the outside of the shaft. So here's an expanded view. This is without the other end of the yoke on that shaft, but we have the tubular structure of the shaft, and then we've got the yokes already welded onto the shaft here. And then these are the universal joints. So they are that crisscross patterns, and there's needle bearings in those. And then this is the assembled version. So both of these shafts would move inward and outward, again, depending upon the movement of that implement attached to the tractor. And here's a close-up of that yoke. We all use PTO shafts. If you've ever ridden in a pickup truck, that is the same principle that drives the rear axle with the power coming from the transmission. So on the underside of this truck, we've got the transfer case here where the arrow of the cursor is. And then we've got this drive shaft, which is essentially a PTO shaft leading from that transfer case, where the transmission is producing that rotational power, and then it is being transferred to the rear axle, and that is going to cause the wheels to spin. So it's the same principle. We have a shaft, we have universals, we have yokes. Most of the time when we look at PTO shafts today, they have a plastic sleeve on them, and that sleeve is actually a guard. You would not want to do this. Guys, I cannot stress enough how much power takeoff shafts should not be abused and not be I guess lazy around. We want to be on our game. We want to have the habit of walking around that piece of equipment, even if it's off, and not get in the habit of leaning on them or walking over them. But this shaft here has a plastic sleeve on it, and if you were to bump up against it or something were to fall on it, that sleeve is made to just stay in place and not rotate. There's a little plastic ring that the actual shaft slides around. Now, the problem with that, if you lift a piece of equipment too high, you get into a ditch where there is this super pivoting that's happening between the drawbar of the tractor and the mower or whatever implement you are moving. Sometimes those sleeves get a wrinkle in them, and then they actually do start to rotate, and they can become a hindrance to your safety if that you let your guard down around them. So even with the shield in place, it is not a good idea to trust it. Just avoid making contact with the PTO shaft at all costs. And we've talked about this in tractor safety already. PTO shafts can be stopped abruptly. So there's a couple of examples here, but I'm guessing with this mower on the left-hand side, there was an obstruction that was hit, some stump or rock or a tree that the guy thought he could mow over. And there are some fail safes in place most of the time, but if they weren't assembled correctly, they can actually cause that inertia from this obstruction to be transferred to the shaft. And that's one of the reasons that they are a tubular design. We would much rather want to replace this $200 or $500 PTO shaft than to have to disassemble the rear end of the tractor and do some internal PTO gearing work. So by all means, this is the better way to go. But they do have a tendency to twist. Because they are tubular, because they are hollow, there's lots of different types. Some of them have advantages, some of them don't. We have a very traditional square type PTO shaft here. We don't see a lot of square PTO shafts anymore. I'm not really sure why. We just don't. I think it's because of the necessity of getting those angles exactly right, and a lot of people when they manufacture square tubing or square steel rod or bar, sometimes the tolerances can be a little bit different depending upon if it's hot rolled or cold rolled, and if people have an issue where there is a failure, they might find the wrong size shaft or something that's close and then stick it in there and run it, and it could cause a lot of damage pretty fast if it's not exactly what's needed. So to avoid that, we get some of these tubular PTO shaft designs that are very exact for the application. We've got the star patterns, we've got the three-sided eyelet pattern here, and then we have just the straight up arched pattern here. So no matter what shaft you're using, make sure you have the right one. And if you don't know, you could always just bring that to the parts store when you're doing your shopping for your repair. So we have two types of fail safes in place for power takeoffs. One that we're seeing more commonly is called a slip clutch, which you can see in the right-hand side of the screen here. And essentially what it is, we'll talk about its makeup, but you have two plates, and then around there are these springs that provide tension to these plates, and sandwiched between those plates are these things called friction discs, essentially the same material as clutches. That's why we call them a slip clutch. So they will most of the time hold enough friction and enough tension on those plates in order for the gearbox to turn. In this case, it's a rotary mower, a bush hog. But if an obstruction occurs, like we hit a stump or we bottom out and we run the mower into the ground, instead of twisting the shaft, instead of causing damage to the tractor PTO, the clutches are just going to rotate, and typically they'll smoke and they will smell really bad when they do so. And we can get off the tractor and then we can retorque them after inspecting them. So we can keep on going. The other type is called a shear pin or a shear bolt. Term is used synonymously, and it just goes through the shaft on the gearbox and the yoke end on the universal joint of the PTO shaft. And if an obstruction is hit, the shear strength is designed to break that bolt instead of bending the shaft, damaging the gearbox, or destroying the PTO system on the tractor itself. So the slip clutch, just to go a little bit further here, you can see we've got number 3 and number 7 are those steel plates. In the middle, we have that driveline shaft that goes all the way through this entire makeup. And then 4 are the friction discs. And those are what's going to actually slip in the clutching system. And then we have bolts and the springs and the nuts that provide tension to that clutch pack. That way, we can mow or we can use that implement most of the time. Shear bolts, those are typically going to be a grade 5 bolt, and a grade 5 bolt's going to have 3 marks on it, as you can see here. I go to the parts store occasionally, and a lot of times that I'm in there, guys are buying shear bolts from the parts store, and that's fine. I'm not trying to knock it if that's what you and your family decide to do. The downside to that is there's a markup on tractor parts from the parts store, and I know a lot of people want to get the right thing, but guys, a grade 5 bolt's a grade 5 bolt's a grade 5 bolt. Go to Tractor Supply where they sell them by the pound. Go to Lowe's where they're going to be cheaper than Lawson's or John Deere, and just get the bolt that fits. Get a few of them. It's good to have several of these on hand. Lots of times they will actually elongate or they will fracture a little bit before they completely break. So if you've been mowing, especially in some real thick material or some saplings that are like the size of your thumb, or you've got a lot of hay to bale, and it's a greener crop because the weather's not been good, you can run into some instances where you're going to shear some pins. So it's good to have some of these on hand. Just a little tip from Anderson. If you know the size bolt you need, you can go to any hardware store and get them a lot cheaper than you can from the dealer. They're going to tell you that they have to come from that vendor. That's not true. So here's one on a hay baler attaching to the flywheel and the drive system of the baler. We've got this shear bolt in place. Just tighten it down with a nut and keep on going. Lots of times the obstruction on a baler is going to be our chamber that we're making the bale in is packed too full of material, and the baler can't actually physically plunge it. So if the bolts break, not only do you have to replace that bolt, but you have to go through and unplug the baler and then feed it slowly, or you're just going to continue to break these bolts. I have a buddy who feeds a lot of cattle, and he's got an old Pat's mixer, and the thing kept shearing bolts. And, he's trying to feed this mixer with a lot more silage and haylage than he needs to, but he just went ahead and put a grade 8 bolt in, and she stopped shearing bolts. So, do what you want. There is a shear threshold in place for a reason. Some final notes, guys. PTO shafts can be a bear to get hooked up and a bear to get lined up. In the reading, you're going to learn about different types of locking mechanisms for these shafts. I prefer to put oil on PTO shafts than grease. The grease will start to solidify. If grease doesn't move, it gets this real cakey texture to it, and it doesn't allow for that forward movement. It also kind of solidifies and gets that cakiness in the winter months as well. Oil doesn't have that effect. So if that you have PTO locking mechanisms that are stuck, or the shaft won't go on the stub shaft of the tractor, or it's really hard to slide in and out in that telescoping action, use oil. Universal bearings need to be greased every time you use them. We don't want to grease them to the point where grease is just pouring out of the bearing because we're compromising the seal. But we want to hear there's like a popping noise associated with filling them with grease. And once we hear that pop, it's pushing the air out, and then we'll want to give them a couple of pumps. Each manufacturer is going to have a recommendation on how many hours of operation can occur before they need to be re-greased. So just follow that guideline. The PTO stub shaft coming out of the tractor turns clockwise. So it is best if that you set yourself up in the field for right turns only, if you can. I understand that sometimes that's not always possible, but when you turn left with a trailed piece of equipment, it doesn't matter if it's on the 3-point hitch, but if it's a trailed piece of equipment like this square baler here and you're turning left, that universal joint is turning outside of itself, if you will. So we've got this universal joint here, okay? And it is made to turn any way, but if that we can turn right, we are actually turning that universal joint inside of itself. If you're turning left, it's turning outside of itself as it's trying to turn clockwise. And it can put some extreme stress on there, and it sounds awful. So the next time you're operating a tractor and you have the PTO on, you want to see, was my ag teacher right? Go ahead and take a left-hand turn and compare it to the sound of a right-hand turn. So try and set yourself up for right-hand turns. Another thing to do, even if it is a right-hand turn, try to avoid extreme angles. There is going to be a bottoming out threshold of what that power takeoff shaft can handle. And obviously the rear tire is going to hit the drawbar of the implement that you're towing, but you want to be extremely careful when doing so. Again, that puts undue stress on those joints. Guys, that's all I have on PTO shafts today. Answer the questions, share them with me, and we'll see you tomorrow to start hydraulics, I think.